Welcome to the Marketing Behind Rapid Growth, the podcast where we explore the strategies, decisions, and growth engines behind some of the world's most successful technology companies. Today, we're talking about OpenAI. Picture this. It's a cold morning in January 2016. 10 researchers are packed into Greg Brockman's living room. The night before, they'd announced something audacious to the world, a new lab backed by $1 billion pledge with a mission most of Silicon Valley quietly considered ridiculous. Build artificial general intelligence. But there's no celebration in that room. There's a whiteboard, freshly ordered, still smelling like a stationery store. And there's silence. Someone finally asks the question every founder dreads. Sam Altman remembers it clearly. They looked at each other and said, "So what do we do now?" They didn't have a product. They didn't have a roadmap. They had a mission statement and a blank whiteboard. What they decided to do first was almost quaint by today's standards. They decided to write research papers. It's hard to imagine looking at OpenAI today that this is where it started, because this is a company that now claims something like 800 million weekly users. A company negotiating funding rounds 4 times larger than the biggest IPO in history. A company that data centers, entire power grids, and global chip supply chains now bend around. So how do you get from a living room in Mountain View to that? The answer isn't really about algorithms, it's about a strategy, one built on conviction, timing, and narrative, that turned a research lab into one of the fastest growing companies the world has ever seen. Let's start with the bet nobody else was willing to make, the heretical bet on scale. In 2015, the mainstream view inside artificial intelligence research was skepticism bordering on dismissal. Neural networks, many senior researchers believed, were a dead end. Scaling them up was seen as a parlor trick, something that looked impressive in a demo but would eventually collapse under its own weight, plunging the field into another so-called AI winter. OpenAI's founding bet ran directly against that consensus. The idea was simple to state and enormous in its implications. Deep learning works, and it gets predictably better as you scale it up. This wasn't just a scientific hunch, it was a business wager with staggering stakes. Because if intelligence really was a function of compute and data, then the bottleneck wasn't cleverness anymore. It was capital. Lots of it. That realization forced OpenAI's first major strategic pivot. In 2019, the organization moved from a pure non-profit structure to what's known as a capped profit model. This wasn't bureaucratic housekeeping. It was an admission that building AGI wasn't a project you could fund with a few $1 billion and some goodwill. It was a project that would eventually cost hundreds of billions. OpenAI needed to stop behaving like an academic lab and start behaving like an infrastructure company. That single shift, from writing papers to building industrial-scale compute, set the stage for everything that followed. An accident that became a marketing masterstroke. For years, OpenAI operated mostly out of public view. GPT-1 and GPT-2 came and went, generating interest among researchers but little more. GPT-3 and its API launch in 2020 hinted at commercial potential. But the real turning point, the moment that changed the company's trajectory forever, happened almost by accident. In November 2022, OpenAI released ChatGPT. It wasn't positioned as a landmark product launch. Internally, it was described as a low-stakes research preview, a way to gather data on how people would interact with the model. The interface was about as simple as software gets. A plain chat box. Sam Altman has admitted since that he underestimated it. He expected that for a product like this to succeed, the interface would need to be far more sophisticated. Instead, that simplicity was the entire point. By giving people an interface they already understood, something as familiar as texting, OpenAI handed the public a way to access a kind of power they'd never had before without requiring them to learn anything new. That's product market fit in its purest form. Not innovation in the interface. Innovation hidden behind a completely unremarkable one. This became the blueprint for what's often called OpenAI's iterative deployment strategy. Rather than holding back a finished, polished, perfect AGI for some dramatic unveiling, the company released capability in increments. Small steps, frequent updates. Let the public adjust in real time instead of being blindsided all at once. Strategically, this did 2 things simultaneously. It prevented the kind of societal shock that might have triggered a serious backlash. And it kept OpenAI constantly in the headlines, constantly associated with the frontier of what AI could do, building a brand that, for millions of people, became a synonym for artificial intelligence itself. Controlling the story. But growth wasn't only happening in the product, it was happening in the way OpenAI talked about itself. While much of the industry avoided grandiose language, worried about sounding overhyped, OpenAI leaned all the way in. They talked openly about AGI, about superintelligence, at a time when those words made plenty of serious researchers uncomfortable. That boldness had a very specific business function. It captured the imagination of the most talented people in the field. OpenAI wasn't just competing for researchers with a paycheck, it was competing on mission. And mission won, again and again. Researchers walked away from offers at Google and Meta worth 2 to 3 times more in compensation, leaving 8-figure unvested stock packages on the table because they wanted to be part of the team they believed was actually building the future. In an industry where the scarcest resource isn't capital but talent, that narrative became a recruiting weapon more powerful than any salary negotiation. Even moments of internal panic were folded into the story. When competitive threats emerged, Google's Gemini or the Chinese model DeepSeek, OpenAI's internal alarms, sometimes called code reds, had a way of becoming public knowledge. Rather than looking like weakness, that paranoia read as intensity. It reinforced the idea that OpenAI was a company perpetually fighting to stay ahead, always sprinting. Competitive pressure, repackaged, became proof of relevance. The consumer-first Trojan horse. By 2025, OpenAI had unquestionably won the consumer conversation. But the real money, the durable, scalable revenue, was sitting in the enterprise. And most companies were struggling to capture it. They were seeing negative returns on their AI investments, largely because they were bolting new tools onto old workflows instead of rethinking those workflows entirely. OpenAI's answer was to let the consumer product do the enterprise selling for them. The logic was straightforward. If enough people used ChatGPT in their personal lives, they'd start expecting it at work. It's almost an exact replay of what happened with the iPhone. Individuals bought the device first. IT departments had no choice but to catch up later. From there, the product strategy evolved again. This time around a phrase Altman began using deliberately. Intelligence as a utility. Something like electricity or water. Something that should become so cheap and so abundant that metering it barely makes sense. That thinking led to tools like Codex and a wave of agentic products. Software that didn't just summarize a document, but went out and did the work itself. The acquisition of OpenClaw in 2026 pushed this even further, signaling a shift away from simply demonstrating clever capabilities toward building what amounts to workflow infrastructure. Not just a smart assistant, but the plumbing underneath it. Something that could operate your computer, read your messages, and carry out tasks that span multiple days without a human checking in at every step. Becoming too big to fail, which brings us to where things stand now. As of 2026, OpenAI has entered its most aggressive phase yet, anchored by something called Project Stargate, a funding round of $110 billion, roughly 4 times the size of the largest IPO ever recorded. The underlying bet is almost brutally simple. Whoever controls the most compute wins. By locking in commitments from Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, and SoftBank, OpenAI has embedded itself into the infrastructure of the global economy in a way that makes it extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. This is no longer a software company in any conventional sense. It's closer to a sovereign-scale infrastructure project, building data centers that draw more power than entire countries. The wager is that there's a massive gap, sometimes called the capability overhang, between what these models can already do and what the world has actually figured out how to use them for. And closing that gap, OpenAI is betting, is worth trillions. What this story teaches. Step back from the headlines and a few strategic lessons come into focus. The first is that conviction has to come before data, not after. In the earliest days, there was no proof that scaling would work the way OpenAI believed it would. By the time the data existed to confirm the theory, competitors were already too far behind to catch up. The second is about timing versus form. A product can be released, receive a lukewarm reception, and then, with the exact same interface, become a sensation months later, simply because the model underneath it got smarter. In this industry, timing can matter more than design. The third is about who you hire. OpenAI consistently prioritized scrappy, high-velocity researchers over polished, credentialed operators. They hired for slope, not for where someone was starting from. The fourth is about durability. As models become more commoditized over time, the things that don't commoditize are brand and personalization. A product that remembers your history, your context, your business, that becomes something people don't want to leave, regardless of what a competitor's raw model can do. And the fifth is perhaps the most fundamental. Marketing, done right, isn't about persuading people to buy something they don't need. It's about educating the market on what to expect next, and making your product feel less like an option and more like an inevitability. Closing thoughts. The story of OpenAI isn't really a story about a chatbot. It's a story about what happens when a small group of people make a contrarian bet on where technology is headed, back that bet with real conviction long before the evidence exists, and then combine it with a narrative bold enough to pull the world's best talent and public attention toward them. They didn't just build a product. They built a platform shift, and used marketing not as decoration on top of the technology, but as one of the primary engines that made the technology matter to the rest of the world. That group in Greg Brockman's living room, staring at a blank whiteboard, asking what to do next, they're not on that couch anymore. They're building what they describe as infrastructure for a planet's worth of intelligence. Whether that vision fully arrives or not, the growth playbook that got them this far is already written into the record. This was the marketing behind rapid growth. See you in the next episode.